Good morning. Some of you are super happy this morning. Others of you, not so much. Since I'm a Bears fan, I was rooting for the 49ers because I don't get to see Rodgers lose often when he plays against the Bears. So it was a good night with Robbie Gould kicking that field goal, and I hope I'm not putting a damper on anybody's spirits right now. But I'm excited that we are concluding this series. This series has been something that Matt and I have been talking about for months and months, and talking about discipleship and how we can get more involved, how we can get deeper in our relationship with God. And so we came up with this series, and so a lot of fun putting it together. And so it's our final week. It's kind of the 4 different aspects or qualities of what it means to be a disciple of Christ. There are a lot more qualities, but that makes a bigger acronym. And so real is a lot easier to kind of grasp and to put together. And so that's kind of how we came up with it. And so these different qualities of discipleship are not things that we do perfectly, but they are things that we strive for, things that we work towards, things that we constantly improve upon in our lives and work towards. And so the first is a reverence towards God, this fear of God, this respect and worship of God. And so that's that first quality. The second is enduring habits, or putting disciplines and habits in place in our lives so that it continues to guide us and direct us in our relationship with God, because there's so many things that begin to pull us off course. The third is having an attitude for adversity. The easiest way to kind of talk about this is to have a theology of suffering, to realize that suffering happens in everybody's life, but God doesn't change in that. That God is still faithful, He's still available, He is still there. And so as we go through our sufferings, as we go through the struggles and the trials of life, or whatever life begins to throw at us, we can always trust in God and put our hope in God. And then today, this final week, we are going to talk about creating a lifelong impact in the world around us and having an impact on people's lives in the world. Now, many a times when we think about our impact, we only think big. We think that our impact has to be big and massive, and we have to have, people write books about us and like podcasts about us, or whatever, the new medium is that we want. But many times we don't think that even doing the small things actually makes an impact. And so we struggle with that. We think that we have to be rich or influential or powerful, or have something that we can kind of hang our hat on in order for us to make an impact. And so if you take, the top 50 people in the world, the richest people in the world, we could maybe name 5 of them. But beyond that, even those 5, they're not really making an impact. They're not really changing the world. They're not really creating a difference in the world around them. And so many times we think that those wealthy people, those people who are famous or who we remember their names, somehow were the most influential. But in the end, that's kind of 1% of 1%. And so we elevate them, and we think that we have to be like that in order to actually make a difference, or in order to actually make an impact on the world. But I want to challenge you to think about the little guys. What about the little guys, right? What about the 99%? The guys that we don't remember their names. We don't understand who they are or know who they are, or in all honesty, they're not famous, and nobody really knows that they made an impact, right? What about the person who started the Catalyst organization that we're a part of? Do you know the name of the person who started the Catalyst organization that our church is a part of? Me neither. I did bad research. But there is somebody who helped, or some people who helped start this organization. We wouldn't exist without these people who made a drastic impact on our lives, even though we can't pinpoint them, even though we can't say, this is the person who changed my life, or who changed our lives. Or what about your Bibles? If you open up your Bibles and you've got NIV, ESV, NASB, NLT, any more acronyms that we can come up with. You've got all kinds of Bibles and all kinds of people who've poured their lives into translating that word. How many of you know a single person's name on that translator's list? Me neither. And yet without them, we would not have the Bibles that we read. Without their dedication and their patience and their endurance to translate from dead languages into a living language and just try and capture what the author was trying to say, without that dedication, we wouldn't have the Bible. And I would venture to say, none of us here probably know Hebrew and Greek enough to actually understand or read that. And I mean, Matt's pretty smart with that, but we Google stuff a lot. Like, let's not put ourselves on a pedestal here. But that's kind of the reality of what it means to make an impact. It might not be that you're the number one or you're the most famous or you're the biggest. It might mean that you are just faithful. What about the person who led you to Christ? Does anybody else in the room know that person, or is it just you? And yet without their faithfulness to God, without their dedication to God, without that aspect of their lives where they said, I'm going to do what God called me to do, you might not be in that chair. You might not have that relationship with God. But because of their faithfulness, because of their passion and their desire, they were faithful to what God called them to. And so instead of getting caught up in making that big impact, maybe our mindset should shift towards being kind of the pebble that gets dropped into the water. And you see the ripple effect that kind of goes out from that. It's not a big rock. It's not a big impact. It's just that pebble, and just allow God to make it into waves, to make it into tidal waves, tsunamis, whatever it is. But just to make that one little impact and let God begin to multiply that and begin to change the world around us. Paul says, I become all things to all men so that by all possible means I might save some. And I was talking with a missionary one time, and he says, what if it said, I become all things to all men so that by all possible means I might save one? Would your life still be worth it if only one person came to faith? Not that we're going out and planting churches and you're going out and seeing villages come to faith and you're seeing crazy, amazing miracles happen. What if it was just one person that you took the time and dedication to pour into, to love, and to just point towards Christ and lead them into salvation? Would your life be worth it? Would it be worth it? And in order to make these changes, in order to see that we can make a lifelong impact, we have to begin to change from the inside out, change our perspective, our thinking, our process, and realizing that making an impact on the world is not that hard. We tend to make it harder than it actually is. And so today we're going to look in Matthew chapter 9. And so if you have your Bibles, you can open up to Matthew chapter 9. And it's a shorter story. It's the first book of the New Testament. Matthew, he's one of the disciples, and he's a really good writer, but super Jewish undertones. And so sometimes he's hard to understand and hard to read, but really good book. And we're going to look at a real simple story, a real simple text to unpack, but there's going to be 4 powerful things that we unpack in it. So if you open up to Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 through 38, we're going to read it together also. We'll put it on the screen. But if you want to open up there, we're going to dive into this. So Matthew chapter 9, verse 35 to 38. All right, it says, and Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to the disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. So, like I said, simple text. Simple text, it lays out that Jesus is doing miracles. He's doing amazing things. People are following him, and they go into the synagogues. And the synagogues of that day, honestly, the easiest way to say it is like Facebook. It's where everybody got their news. It's where everybody got their theology. It's where everybody got angry at each other and, mad at the government. And it's where everybody complained about it. It was literally the hub of information. And so Jesus teaches and preaches there. He sees that the listeners, the people who began to listen to him and follow him, were becoming harassed by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all of them. And his heart begins to break for him. And not only does it break for him, but he begins to hope for something to change in their lives. And so he turns to his disciples and he asks them to pray. And so even though this is a very simple text, a very short text that anybody can read and anybody can really understand it completely, there's 4 powerful things that we're going to kind of dissect from it and see how Jesus, even in the simplest form, made a huge impact and how we can do the same thing. And so to begin with that and to make that change from the inside out, first thing is that we need to see what Jesus sees. We need to see what Jesus sees. So the crowds began to gather, and Jesus' heart for them began to break. He began to have compassion for them because they had no direction. They had no guidance. They had no leadership. And now, Jesus didn't see the crowd as a burden. I mean, he's followed by crowds all over the place. And everywhere he goes, he's followed by crowds. And there are times where he had to get away and he had to go into a boat to go out so that he have even room to talk and to preach. And he took time where he went to pray and seclude himself. But Jesus never saw the crowds around him as a burden. That was never a thing for him. But what he did see was that they needed a shepherd. They needed a leader. They needed somebody to step up in that place. And Jesus, our shepherd, turned to the disciples and he says, it's time to step up. Pray and step up. And many times we sit and we think that in order to make an impact, we have to be powerful. We have to be influential. We have to be first, the best, the top of the tier, the smartest in the room. That when we think of people leading in the church or leading in crews or leading in different capacities, that they're the best of the best. But God doesn't require that of us. God doesn't say you have to have it all together. You have to be perfect in order to stand up here and to lead and to guide or to encourage or to love or to care or to show compassion. You just have to be willing. You just have to be ready. You just have to be available. And the thing that God begins to showcase here and what we begin to see is that it's not about leading and being the best. It's about leading in the capacity and the place that God has us. It's about leading where God has us. It's not about saying, well, when I get this right, or when I get that job, or when I put myself in this place, or when these milestones are hit, then I'll have the capacity to lead, or the capacity to love, or the capacity to share the gospel. God calls us to lead in the capacity that we're in immediately, right here, right now, in our jobs, in our families, with our friends, with our neighborhoods, with our neighbors, with our church, with our crews, with wherever we're at, with whatever we're doing. God calls us to lead in the capacity that he's already given us. And when we begin to look at our community and look at our neighborhood and look at our state and look at what's going on around us and who's around us, the question that we begin to have to ask is do we actually see the lost? Do we see the lost like Jesus saw the lost? Do we see what he sees? Or do we just see our task at hand, our agenda, whatever we're trying to go to do? Or do we actually look for opportunities to love our neighbor as ourselves? Do we go into our house, we shut the door, we shut the blinds, we turn on the TV, and we veg out on our brand new couch? We just got a brand new couch, and I'm super proud of that. But, right, I'm old now. I'm excited about a couch. Do we do that? Do we go in and we seclude ourselves and we're like, all right, I got my Jesus fill, and everyone else outside, you stay out there? Or do we actually see the lost around us? A few times, actually, this happened. I've been driving with people in Arkansas, in Chicago, and even here, where we're driving around and we see this stray animal and we're like, oh, poor thing, Judah, he's like, pick it up. Or like when we see these dogs or these cats, we're like, oh, it's going to be cold out. I wonder if they have a place to stay, or, like, are they lost or whatever. And then we drive up to the stoplight and there's a homeless person who's standing right there, and we do everything we can to not look at them, to avoid them at all costs. Why? Because we don't want to fork out any money. We don't want to have the shame of knowing that we looked at them. I don't like what is it that motivates us to have compassion for a dog and give no craps, excuse my language, about a person, a human being who is standing outside? Do we see what Jesus sees, or do we need to create and change our perspective? Do we need to change our perspective and realign our sight to actually see our neighbors as ourselves? And the reality is your neighbor is not like your neighbor like next door. I mean, that is. But your neighbor in the scripture and how it lays it out is anybody around you, anybody nearby you. At that moment, in that place, that is your neighbor. And so do we see what Jesus sees, and do we see our neighbors, or do we try at all costs to avoid our neighbors and to avoid loving them as much as we love ourselves? The second thing is that we need to feel what Jesus felt. We need to feel what Jesus felt. Once we truly begin to see the people, the life, the breath, the blood inside of them that God himself put there, that Christ died for. Once we begin to see them, we need to actually feel what Jesus felt and be moved towards compassion for them. Now, homeless ministry is easy to highlight because we don't have like social hierarchy the way that many other cultures do. And so we can't easily highlight, the upper culture, the lower culture, the wealth gaps and all that stuff. But for the homeless community, it's easy to pinpoint. And so that it's easy to pinpoint that, but they're hard to minister to. Matt and I were talking about this, and there are more homeless people in communities that don't want help. They don't want to receive any help. They'll take your money so that they can get whatever, but they don't want to actually take any actual steps to get out of there, to get out of the spot that they're in, to get out of the lifestyle that they're in. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, loving our neighbor as ourselves, is that with parameters? Do we need to love them as ourselves only if they're willing to be loved? Only if they're willing to listen? Only if they're willing to participate? Did Jesus say, love your neighbor as yourself when they want it, when it's convenient, when they're receptive to it? Or did he tell us to love them as we love ourselves? This same desire that we're willing to put food in our own mouths and care for our own needs and care for our own effects and our lifestyles, we need to love them with the same capacity. And Judah and Chicago, the homeless community is huge. And it's ridiculous expensive to live there. And so the homeless community grows constantly. And there are hundreds and hundreds of homeless ministries who have taken over apartment complexes that are, 12 and 18 stories tall, and they fill up every room in there. And at the end of the day, every day, they still have to turn people away. There are still people who sleep on the streets because all of the homeless community housing that is there is taken up. And there's amazing ministries, and their heart breaks for these people, and they do everything they can, but there's just still too much. And so Jenny and I, we would go, and as we drive almost every stoplight you get to, there's going to be somebody there who's asking for help, asking for money. And so there's times where we'll have change in the little cup holder or change somewhere, and we'll hand it to them. We'll just try and talk to them and just try and be social. At other times, I still kept the window up and looked forward. I'm not righteous in that way, but there were times that we were like, you know what, like we've seen him, a few times, like he's still here, like let's just try and help. And one day we were going to go walk downtown, and it's so much fun to walk downtown, but there are the homeless people who gather around some of the shopping areas and stuff. And Judah, he was like, hey, Dad, can we get some money out and just hand it out to some of the homeless people? And I'm like, yes, we can, because he's an awesome kid, right? I know. And so we went and got $20 and we gave it all in ones, and he's high rolling and he's super excited, and we're going out and he's V-lining for him, like almost like crossing like busy traffic streets. It's like, there's one over there, let's go, and he begins to hand out $1, $2 a piece to these people. And the amazing thing is that each and every one of them reacted with like this smile and this glow about them. That's not because they got $2. It's because there is literally a person who recognized that they're a human being. That this child saw that there's nothing that they could give him, nothing that they could offer him, nothing that would actually interrupt his life, and he still went and gave them money, and it began to change their perspective. And it was crazy to see. I mean, literally, Jenny and I went home glowing after that ourselves, because we were like, this kid is nuts. That's not us. That's like, this is crazy. But because he saw them as human beings, they began to change their own perspective. They began to see life a little bit differently, that they weren't trash on the side of the road that people just walk past and have pity on. That they were living, breathing people. Somebody that needed to be cared for, somebody that needed to know that they existed. And because this little kid walked up to him in innocence, it changed their perspective. And we need to have that same heart that Christ had. Our heart needs to break for anybody who's in need. Family, friends, co-workers, people that you hear about, people that you don't even know, people that are going through things that you've gone through that you might have no relationship with, that you just step in and begin to pray for them. We need to feel what Jesus felt. And we need to love based on Christ, not on our preoccupations or our predicaments or what categories we say this person deserves love and that person doesn't. Instead of basing it on our circumstances, we need to love our neighbor as ourselves, like Christ loved us. Third, we need to pray like Jesus prayed. Pray like Jesus prayed. Jesus, when he saw the crowd and he had compassion on them, he turned to his community and began to pray as a community. Sadly, I tend to pray when everything is just at its absolute worst. Like, I tend to try and fix and mold and hold together and duct tape my life back up, and it's just crumbling, and it's like, trying to duct tape a water balloon that's just leaking out everywhere. It's just not going to happen, but I believe that I can fix it. And so I begin to do everything I can to just work and work and work and fix and fix and fix. And when it all boils down to it, it all crumbles apart and falls apart. Then I go, oh man, Jesus, I need some help. Then I begin to step into prayer. And the sad thing is that I almost hardly ever turn to community. I almost never turn to other people and say, dude, I'm struggling. I need some help in this. I need you to pray for me. Because I've elevated myself to this thought that I have to live this perfect life. I'm a pastor. I've poured into people. I've led groups. I've taught people about Jesus. I've preached this thing and that thing. And I've elevated myself up to say that I can't show any sort of weakness. I can't show any sort of shame or hurt or pain or anything like that. And so I literally put myself in a box and am terrified at times to ask people for prayer. That is not at all what God created us for. That is not at all what God intended for us to be. Is this set apart, specialized, no need of prayer, but like we're super righteous. God has called us to live in community. to pray in community, to come together as a community of believers seeking God together. That's why we have those prayer cards. It's because if you want to put it anonymously, if you want to put your name on it, if you want somebody to contact you about it, whatever it is, we need to be a praying community. Not only is it on the cards, it's on the app, it's through a text service. There is no other reason that we shouldn't be working together, praying together. That's why we created Cruise, and to have that smaller community and that ability to minister together. That's why we have family and friends that we can reach to and turn to. Like, we don't need to build ourselves on an island. We need to use that opportunity to pray together. And in doing so, we began to grow together. We began to see God move together. We began to see our perspective of prayer change. That many times we think that God has to answer only in this way. And then you get crazy people who see God moving in every way, and they're so encouraging, and it's annoying because Dawn is like that, because she'll see something bad and go, oh, I bet God is going to do something amazing through that. And when you're going through the bad thing, you're like, I don't want to hear that, but dang it if she's not right. And it all boils down, and you're like, man, God moved in a huge way. And Dawn's, yeah, I told you. It begins to change our perspective to where we don't always think that the negative is going to outweigh the positive, but we begin to see that the negative is actually small and that God is big. And when we live in community like that, we see that we're not alone in that. That God can move in mighty ways and encourage us through all of these different voices and these different avenues to build us up so that when the calamity comes, when the struggle comes and the trials come, that we can overcome them through who God is in us and through living as a community together and building each other up. And we need to see that prayer begins to change lives, to see God move in mighty ways, and to give us that change and that new perspective when life comes at us. So we need to pray like Jesus prays. And the fourth thing is that we need to do what Jesus did. And that is an incredibly loaded statement, right? Do what Jesus did. Well, in this moment, Jesus is performing miracles and healing the sick, right? And even Jesus' response to John's disciples when John sends word, he's like, hey, are you the Messiah? Jesus is like, yeah, dude. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who doesn't fall away on the count of what I'm doing. I mean, that's pretty loaded. So go do what Jesus did, right? Amen. All right, sermon over. See, there's so many times where we hear and we see what Jesus did and we just get overwhelmed. Because I've prayed over a lot of people for a lot of things and a lot of different reasons, and God works in mysterious ways. And there are times where those prayers do come true and you see an incredible miracle happen. Or you hear stories of incredible miracles happening. But there are times where we pray and we seek God and we fall on our face before him and he says, I've got a different answer for that. And so do what Jesus did sometimes just becomes overwhelming and we just go, I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. I mean, granted, if we went out and started going to hospitals and blind people seeing and dead people raising from the morgue, you would make a huge impact on the world. You could be super impactful in this community if you were able to do that in every occasion. But most of us can't start there. In fact, most of us don't want to start there. Most of us don't want that limelight. And so even though we say do what Jesus did, it seems impossible. We have to find a starting place. Where can we start if we do what Jesus did? Well, we start by going to Luke. Go to Luke, and Luke tells us exactly what Jesus did. In Luke chapter 19, verse 10, it says, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. So we got the direction, we got the avenue. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. That's where his heart was. And then in Luke chapter 7, verse 34, it says, the Son of Man came eating and drinking. Now, I think we can all get behind that verse right there. Do what Jesus did, eat and drink, cha-ching. I know a guy who makes home brew. I know a guy who cooks a mean barbecue. That's the reality of start with a meal. Where do you start doing what Jesus did? Start with a meal. He did it with Zacchaeus. He's going through a town. Zacchaeus, this wee little man, if you know the song, this wee little man climbed up a tree, and he's super powerful and he's super wealthy, and he knows all these people. And he climbs up to a tree to see Jesus, and Jesus goes, hey, dude, I want to eat a meal with you. We can't go to my house. I'm homeless, but let's go to your house. And so he goes to his house, and he has a meal with them, and he shares a meal with them, and he does all this amazing stuff. And next thing you know, Zacchaeus becomes a believer. Not only does it with Zacchaeus, he does it with Matthew. And he goes to Matthew, this tax collector, this horrible person. He goes, hey, I want to share a meal with you. I'm homeless. Can't do it in my house. Let's go to yours. So he shares the meal with them, shares it with the tax collectors and the sinners, the people that everyone else thinks is horrible, just despicable. I forgot the word. I'm sorry. Horrible people. And yet Jesus goes and he eats with them. And he shares who he is with them. Not only does he do it with Matthew and the tax collector, he does it with the 4,000 that begin to gather, and he breaks bread with them. He shares a meal. Then he does it with 5,000 more, and he breaks bread and he shares a meal with them. And then he takes time and he sits together with his brothers, the men who have served with him, who have bled with him, who have sat there and poured out their lives with him. And he says, guys, let's break bread together. Let's celebrate this Passover, this moment of time where God has done amazing things for the world and does amazing things for Israel and leading them out of Egypt. Let's celebrate the Passover. Let's break bread. And by the way, this is my flesh. Let's drink this wine. And by the way, this is my blood. This symbolism, this imagery, this aspect of you and me living together, moving together, ministering together. And it all starts with just a meal. It starts with just a meal. Of inviting people over, of cooking a meal, of finding that homeless person, sharing a hot meal with them, even just driving around and handing them a sandwich, doing whatever it takes to actually love our neighbor as ourselves. Many people have said throughout history that the only Bible that people will ever read is the Bible of your life. It's how you love your neighbor as yourself. It's how you love people even though they contribute nothing to your life. Even though they can't do anything for your welfare, anything for your growth, anything for your pocket, anything. It's how you love those people. The people that everybody else shames and shuns, who think they're horrible people. It's how you approach them and begin to love them. And it's just as easy as opening your doors, breaking some bread, and loving your neighbor as yourself. Beginning to have conversations with them. Learn who they are. Learn their life story. Learn where they've come from, the trials and the struggles and the amazing things that they've done in their lives. And you begin to see that you are making a lifelong impact in the world around you. Just by eating and drinking and having an eye, an ear, and a heart for the lost. It's hard sometimes for us to get out of our normal and to put ourselves in a situation where maybe we feel uncomfortable, we don't know where the conversations are going or anything like that. But all you have to do is just open the door. Give God an opportunity to shine through you. Share a meal with somebody. Share a drink with somebody. I'm going to finish with this. The real change that begins to happen happens from the inside out. And it's summed up in the two greatest commandments that Christ pointed to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, and with all your soul. And to love your neighbor as yourself. That's how we can make the biggest impact in the world around us. Is to be dedicated and devoted to God and what he has called us to. And to begin to see people as they have value. That Christ died for them also. That he poured out his blood for them also. Which as we move to make an impact on the world, as we move to kind of make these real changes in our lives, I want to encourage you to have that reverence towards God, to put in place enduring habits and disciplines in your life to continue to lead and guide you down that path. To realize tragedy comes and we can have an attitude for adversity to overcome those tragedies by our faith in God. And that through even small acts, we can make a lifelong impact in loving the world around us the way that Christ loved us.